And we're live. Welcome back to another episode of The Professor and the Idiot. I'm Nick Wolfinger.
And I'm Dalton Whitehead.
And so, we had an interview all scheduled for yesterday, but Dalton couldn't make it at the last reason for work reasons. So Nick went ahead and did the interview anyhow, me being Nick, calling myself in the third person like Bob Dole. So we're going to try to play it now and then stop it when we want to talk about it, and then keep playing it. So this may just be an enormous clusterfuck, but we'll try. Okay, and with that, let me now go ahead and play this interview from the beginning, which is coming almost right now. Okay, and we're live. I'm speaking to Victor Wallis, who teaches at the Berklee School of Music, and that is in Boston, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah, actually, it's the College of Music. It has been for the last 30-odd years because they do have a bachelor's degree.
That's what I thought. Victor is the author of many books and articles, most recently Democracy Denied, 5 Lectures in U.S. Politics, and earlier The Red-Green Revolution. He's also the editor of Socialism and Democracy. And you're talking about many themes we've discussed on The Professor and the Idiot. You're talking about the challenge of American exceptionalism when we have the highest levels of incarceration in the world and growing income inequality. Dalton and I both agree that are both upset by the high levels of incarceration. And so you're talking about many of the things we're interested in talking about. So could you tell us a little bit, your thumbnail summaries about what you've written about recently?
Well, the Red-Green Revolution book, the subtitle of that is The Politics and Technology of Ecosocialism, and it brings together essays I've written and published over the last almost 25 years. It was an opportunity really to express the urgency of the situation in which we're all living now, and I tried to think of what it is that it brings that's distinctive. I mean, there have been a lot of writers who've written in this general vein of linking ecology and socialism, which is what I do. I think one of the things my book does that some of the others don't do is go in more detail into some of the technological aspects, and also to go into more about the politics of how groups can come together around the ecological issue, or more generally around the recognition of a common class interest against the priorities of capital. Because my point of departure really is the observation that the environmental crisis is a product of this unhinged development that's been taking place now for generations under the auspices of capitalism, and it spiked considerably after World War II and really launched us into what's been called now a new geological era. And so the urgency of the crisis is now generally recognized. I mean, I take that as a point of departure. It's desperate that something be done about it.
I agree.
And there's not a commensurate awareness on the part of most of the population. I mean, it is increasing bit by bit and even quickly, but it has to increase, this awareness has to increase exponentially faster than it is now. And we're beginning to see traces of this now with the Extinction Rebellion and so on. But the other thing is, in addition to the urgency and the speed of the whole thing, is the whole idea that the necessary changes will not be possible unless everybody is actively involved in bringing them about. They can't just be legislated or decreed by somebody. They have to be the product of a movement, also in order to keep them going and in order to have the kind of continuing discussions that are necessary as we, as a whole species, redesign the conditions of our economic activity and of our lives. So that's the basic thrust of that first book. I mean, there are sections about waste. I try to indicate and give examples of all the different dimensions of production that don't serve human need and that could be curbed or eliminated. Because I like to make the point that the necessary changes that have to be made, even though they involve a reduction in the total use of energy, they're not at the expense of a good life. On the contrary, they can be based on removing dangerous or harmful or wasteful activities, and that the quality of life, if we produced less and actually moved around less and certainly fought fewer wars, would actually be infinitely better. And so it's really a process of making that case, and then talking about the technology in all the various sectors of activity, which include not only the military and information technology, but also agriculture, healthcare, and transportation, manufacturing, and everything. So I go into all those things with, some detail. It's sort of a sketch. I mean, I talk about the level that's been reached in capitalist development of the technology and in what ways it might be different under socialism. And I view technology in a kind of deeper, sort of wider sense, you might say. It's not just the devices, but it's the whole network of relations that determine how those devices are used and how many of them are needed and so on.
So he talked about like fighting less wars, less waste, pollution, all that type of stuff.
Yep.
Whenever I hear people discuss things like this, and I don't know what your opinion on it is, but it's like, I think, or he said like starting a movement, kind of being a collective philosophy, so to speak. I always think like, okay, that sounds great, but in my opinion, nobody's talking, not nobody, but very few people are talking about the biggest tool to accomplish that, and I think that's the use of psychedelic drugs. And that's the reaction most people have when I bring that stuff up.
You went full Rogan on me right there.
I think there's something to it. I think it could change the world. I really do. I wholeheartedly believe it. I don't think everybody should do it. I think it should be studied more and, be taken very seriously. But I think if it wasn't demonized and people could be open to talking about it and being honest about it, I do think it would have a very positive effect on the world.
So just to summarize, if all of our leading politicians in the world took acid, then the world would be a better place?
I don't know about acid because I haven't done that, but certainly mushrooms.
Well,
I think it makes people more compassionate. Some people it might affect differently, but I think the net positive would be tremendous.
I think mushrooms didn't really do it for me. I'm not a hallucinogen person. Made me feel uncomfortable. I certainly there can be benefits. There's certainly some very promising test results about using mushrooms to treat a variety PTSD results look very promising, but why is it that I've never read about this?
Read about it in what way?
Read in the newspaper.
The data.
Or just the suggestion that our leaders need to take mushrooms.
One, I think a lot of people just haven't experienced it, and two, for the people that have, you're looked at as a fool if you bring that up.
I don't think you're a fool.
Well, you don't think that, but a lot of people would.
I don't think no one thinks I'm a fool if I told them I've taken mushrooms.
But I'm talking about like in the politically correct type world. Like, I mean, obviously, like Joe Rogan talks about this all the time, and he's not necessarily demonized. But I mean, if Donald Trump said, I took a trip wherever and I was invited to a shamanic ceremony and I took whatever psychedelic drug and it changed my life, I mean, he would be laughed at. I think most people will be like, "Oh, he's on drugs. He's gone full blown insane, and he needs to be impeached." Like,
I would simply point out that there's no track record for this whatsoever, that tells me it may not be a practical solution.
I don't think it's a solution. I think it's a tool.
Okay. All right. Should we continue?
Yep.
And play. So I think the one point where I might depart from you is the linkage you suggest between our economic system, socialism versus capitalism, and our economic crisis. And my immediate impulse is to note the curvilinear relationship between economic development and pollution. As countries develop, they pollute more, and then when an economy becomes sufficiently advanced, it becomes concerned about climate change and starts figuring out how to pollute less. And one part of that is capitalism fueling new technology, such as the incredible solar revolution that enables it to reduce its carbon footprint. So how do you square that understanding with a desire to have both socialism and increased environmental awareness?
Well, the pressures to make those changes come from outside of capital, so to speak. I mean, there's a whole section of my book where I talk about research and innovations and how so much of the innovation for which capitalism takes the credit is actually what takes place within, let's say, non-profit making institutions, whether it's government or universities, and that what capitalism does is it skews the support for one technology over another. So although you have a development of solar technologies, the subsidies still go to the petroleum sector, and the solar technology is not nearly as widely diffused as it might otherwise be. And so although you can have the development of technology, and I certainly make the point that useful technologies have been developed within a capitalist framework, although not as much thanks to capital itself. Capital takes them and uses them. We, the taxpayers, pay for them, and capital appropriates them. But then the question of which technologies will be most promoted is a political question. And so for example, in the sphere of mass transit, I mean, the decision to switch away from the overuse of private vehicles would have to be a political decision. It can't be made within the context of capitalism. So capitalist development, the other thing to be said about it also is that even though we may have improvements in our environmental situation in, let's say, within the United States, for example, part of the overall project, it's a global system, and much of the activity that would otherwise have taken place here has been outsourced, takes place now in China, and so whatever pollution is caused in China is inseparable from the whole international economic network of which we're a part. So it is very much a kind of international issue, and the point is to take the economic decisions out of the hands of those who make them on the basis of trying to sell something, maximize sales, and put them in the hands of the community as a whole, acting on a thoroughly informed basis, so that whatever benefits have been developed within the capitalist framework.
So that's the argument Victor will make over and over again, that capitalism makes bad choices that are not in our interests, and to make better choices, he thinks that if people are all educated, they will make what he calls better choices. And so he will make this in various ways. Anyhow, we can continue, but I will, I will give a tiny bit of ground, but then push back a lot on this, just because, among other things, I'm a capitalist.
Okay.
Hit and play.
We can keep those, but not, get rid of the dangerous and wasteful aspects.
Let me agree with you on one point. This is when I'm arguing with Dalton about the role of the government, a point I'm making again and again. That is that the extractive energy companies are basically like giant commodity funds. They don't have much room to innovate, and so a lot of energy innovation comes from the government. That having been said, it's capitalism that helps bring it to scale. Right? I mean, so the money from a government, from NSF or some other government agency will result in the innovation of a new technology. But
Yeah.
making it work at scale is what's the share accomplished by the private sector. Or am I wrong on that?
Well,
I think,
it is.
okay, Dalton, you never might have thought you were going to do a podcast all about energy subsidies and government contributions to energy innovation, but here we are.
The dream come true.
I just wanted to say that. We are doing a podcast where we've repeatedly, over and over again, talked about this point. Continuing. But, did I defend capitalism well?
Yeah, I thought it was pretty good.
All right. Hit and play.
It's done by the private sector in a capitalist economy, but the question of what's socially useful is something that they don't necessarily take into account. So, for example, if you take the development of all the computer high-tech stuff, which was largely pioneered within the government, it's not just that the government developed it and then capital diffuses it. There's also the whole question of the constant replacement, the innovation for its own sake. So in my book, I strongly criticize the idea that innovation as such is good. It may be good, it may not be good, and one of the senses in which it isn't good is the idea that you innovate, you create a new device simply in order to find more sales, and you create new needs just the way that you have model changes or fashions and this type of thing, and you replace one system by another. And I mean, to me, the whole evolution from the fixed phone system to the mobile phone system is an example of this. And now if you have a household of several people, instead of just selling one phone to the household, you sell one to each individual. And so that multiplies the number of phone sales. So you do away with the public phone, so anyone who doesn't have their own cell phone is kind of lost. And it used to be you could just, in any city, you could, if you needed to make a phone call, you just find a phone booth and you make a phone call. So it's all that kind of principle multiplied many times over, which creates an enormous amount of production that would otherwise not be necessary, and the energies devoted to it could either be conserved or used for some other purpose, and all of which could be decided on. And plus which, there's the other whole question in regard to technologies like that, the infrastructure that has to be put in place, and of the lack of debate over what the physical health consequences of that infrastructure, the radiation, may be. It's not even discussed, and there's even a kind of prohibition of discussing it when the Telecommunications Act was passed in 1996. So all this is kind of plowing straight forward ahead, always more, that kind of attitude, which is what is really at the root of the environmental crisis, is this growth without limit, or as a lot of people have made the point, you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet.
Well, there's several places I could go. I think questions I have. Second, I think it would be a tough sell to convince people that they don't need smartphones at this point. that having been said, I totally acknowledge your point about the planned obsolescence of phones. And
Mm-hmm.
Apple bringing out a model every 2 years. I don't need a
Yeah.
different iPhone every
Yeah.
2 years. Still, uh, I like my phone, and I imagine other people like theirs. So
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question because I know one gets attached to certain things and one gets used to them and one can't live with it. They seem to be indispensable. But the thing is, one organizes one's life on the assumption that it's this way, and therefore one can't do without it. So I mean, you could apply that similar reasoning to the extreme amount of air travel that's taking place, which is one of the most. I mean, the fact that there can be so this instantaneous or almost instantaneous travel between one place and another, and you do away with all the infrastructure for the railroads. Well, people become dependent on planes, and then they want their private planes, and if they have the money for it, and so all these things. What's a necessity and what's and what isn't?
besides that,
Well, well, the thing is, it needs to be a social decision. So if you look at the transit question in general, individually, I may decide to buy a car, but the reason for my needing a car is that there is not an adequate infrastructure that allows me to do what I need to do without it. So although the individual may make the decision, the parameters within which the decision is made are set by the institutions, mostly the corporations and the market, with the government chipping in to some extent. And they do that for housing as well. I mean, the development of the suburbs, that's a whole story of how, and it involves racial considerations as well, and the whole idea of separating individuals, and there was a kind of conscious project of that. One of the little-known facts that I found along the way is that the famous Senator Joseph McCarthy, who's notorious for his red hunting, was also the chair of the Federal Housing Authority in that period when they set up all these federal projects to encourage suburban development and get people out of the cities where they could congregate and constitute potentially oppositional forces. So the decisions that seem to be made, like an individual goes on, just needs a place to live, and so what's the economics of the different possible approaches, and you look at the economics. It may be set up so that you have all the incentives to buy a private house and a car and all that.
Okay,
but
pause.
The parameters.
okay.
So, he thinks like there should be an elaborate enough public transport system that people don't need cars.
That seems like a tough sell and an impossibility under current conditions. I certainly think there should be more public transportation. I certainly agree with him that too much public transportation was dismantled in the 1950s, but I don't know. Would that work for you? Just to be able
No,
yeah.
no. I need to go to multiple places on a tight schedule. If it's just impossible.
Have you been in a city that's well served by subways?
No.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's not the Bay Area where I live. It's not Salt Lake City where there's a light rail. I have. It's like places like Tokyo where I just was, or New York. There you can get by without having a car, but that's a dense city. Yeah, that doesn't... And people live out in the suburbs and country and shit.
Yeah. Well, also you have a car so you can leave the city.
Yeah.
Like, so you're just trapped in this city forever, or the whole country's just one giant railway system just so people can move about?
There will be regularly scheduled outings to the country, Dalton.
Jesus Christ.
But, well, yeah, this actually, this would serve me better since I don't like going into the country, but I'm not. Most people are more like you and actually want to go off on their own in the country.
Yeah. All right. Let's play.
All right. I just saw a point out a really interesting pod I listened to about the future of self-driving cars. And it may come a point where there would be sometime 100 years in the future, might be enough cars where we could not have them anymore, because if you want one, you hit the button on your phone and one arrives in a minute. But that's some science fiction shit right there.
Yeah.
I'm hitting play.
Okay.
I'm really hitting play.
That drive you in that direction have been set by policymakers, either governmental or corporate.
But how is that a fault of capitalism? I just got back 2 days ago from a 10-day vacation in Tokyo. And one of the things I notice almost every time I'm abroad is how much better the subway system is compared to any such system I've been on in the United States. So that just seems not like a flyability of capitalism, but just American...
Not like a what? Sorry, I didn't understand.
How much better the subway system is anywhere I go compared to any subway system in the United States.
Yeah.
So that makes me think that the failure to develop public transportation in this country is a political flaw rather than a product of capitalism.
Well, but what determines the political priorities? I mean, the idea that public transportation is sort of a residual category, that the real emphasis is on private cars, that's definitely a reflection of the corporate interest. The dismantling of the national railroad system in favor of the highway system, which is a subsidy to the private automobile industry, that's a government decision made at the behest of capital and reflecting the fact that the key policy-making positions in the government are occupied by representatives of capital directly.
So, but why didn't that happen to the same extent in Europe and Japan?
Well, because in other countries, I mean, and this is what I get into in my book, Democracy Denied. In other countries, the working class movement has been stronger than it has been in the United States. And so that as a result, there have been social democratic workers' parties, socialist parties, communist parties that have had a significant weight in government decisions. So you have a much bigger public sector. The whole idea of the welfare capitalism or social democracy is a reflection of stronger working class parties. And the United States has never had a really strong working class party. It was beginning to develop one in the early 20th century, but it suffered quite extreme repression. And the whole process of possibly developing such a party was hamstrung in a way from the outset by the racial division resulting from the extraordinary role of slavery in the economy of the United States. And I mean, that's remained a factor with us. So the United States working class has been politically weaker than in any of the other advanced countries because of this largely racial division plus repression at key moments. And so capitalism has been left more uninhibited in the United States than in these other countries, which have better public services, including not only railroad and subway, but also health services in particular.
So I would certainly agree with you about the point of America's racial tragedy affecting the development of a stronger working class party. One example of that I like to trot out a lot is Richard Nixon's support of affirmative action. And that may come as a surprise to some people, but he supported it because he knew it would split the working class vote. So let me ask you of a term you've used a lot, and in both here and in the interviews I've heard of yours or read about, and something we've discussed on the podcast, something a lot of people are talking about nowadays, is socialism. What do you mean by that? Is that the way Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is using it, or something else?
Yeah, it's something else. I mean, I defined socialism at the beginning of the Red Green Revolution book as a society in which there's no longer class division between the owners of capital and the rest of the population. And that's really I would say, a strong definition of socialism.
Yes.
What Bernie Sanders, in his speech that he gave, he was explicitly asked in the 2016 campaign to make a speech about socialism. He made his speech, and he indicated he was not calling for the end of capitalism. What he was calling for was a welfare state. And he said as much, and his great model was Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal, and that's, in other words, that's what is commonly referred to as social democracy.
Right. And
sometimes they call it democratic socialism, but that's a little bit. The actual content of what people like the Democratic Socialists of America, of which AOC is a member, and it amounts to social democracy. It's
right.
So it's a capitalism with a human face, as I like to sometimes say. So I'm saying the reason I say that one has to have a stronger definition or one has to have a stronger goal is that if you don't have that, then there will still be an enormous portion of the economic decisions that will still be made on the basis of the principle of maximizing sales and production and profit and growth and so on. And also the other point being that if you have the social democratic reforms and you retain, you don't call into question, you don't get sort of dissolve the dominant class, they will try to undo. They'll be perpetually trying to undo all the progressive changes you've made, and we know this very well in the United States from all the. The Democratic Party in the 1980s explicitly repudiated basically its New Deal heritage and went back in favor of what they call small government now, and ending welfare as we know it, as the way Clinton put it. So social democracy is, you're still living in a capitalist society, you still have a capitalist class, and the capitalist class is not going to give up its attempt to maximize its own benefits, which means cutting back the public welfare dimension.
So for what it's worth, I consider myself something of a Moynihan liberal. I think so far Elizabeth Warren is perhaps my preferred candidate of 2016 because her very articulated policy proposals and all-around wonkishness resonate with me. Mm-hmm. But that having been said, when you use terms like disrupt, and taking I can't remember the exact word you used, depriving the people, the current owners of capital, that evokes violent imagery, right? I'm thinking about doesn't that evoke violent revolution?
Well, that's a whole big topic. And I think the important thing to point out, even before you get into the process of revolution, which is obviously going to be different in each country.
I just note, it would have been easier for him to say, no, I don't need violent revolution. He didn't say that.
Well, if you want to beat capitalism, that's what it takes, because most people want it, so you need to end it by force.
Right. It was the history of Russia in 1917 that there were various other socialist parties, but they all preached socialism as a gradual evolution through the ballot box and evolution. But, of course, the violent ones were the ones who won.
Yeah. And then you have to have a violent revolution to stop it.
Yeah, well, no, though. Look, Russia just fell, the Soviet Union just fell apart. China turned quite capitalist on its own.
So they just die before they fall apart, or millions die before they fall apart?
Yeah, and we'll get to the millions in a second.
Okay.
And, Victor has, you'll see his answer.
To take into account the extraordinary level of violence that is routine within the context of capitalism, and because the expansionist drive of capital leads to constant war. And now, if we don't know this now in the United States, the United States has been at war continuously now for the last 30 years or so, and there wasn't much of an interval before that when it wasn't, and it's no accident because capital has this drive for control, and of course the U.S. is a country in which it's been least inhibited and has officially proclaimed as a doctrine of government, the national security doctrine, the prerogative to intervene anywhere in the world if it doesn't like the government that's there. So it doesn't matter whether it's democratic or not. I mean, they'll support. Saudi Arabia is to me the thing. Anyone who claims that the U.S. role in the world is to support democracy, I just mentioned Saudi Arabia, and they think twice about that. So there's an extraordinary amount of violence, and the violence that is perpetrated in other parts of the world is made possible by preserving a culture
Nick.
within this country.
Yeah.
What do you think about that, as Saudi Arabia comments?
Oh, Saudi Arabia is terrible, right? Saudi Arabia is an awful dictatorship, and they have been our allies for reasons of both capitalism, we need the oil, and national security. But yeah, Saudi Arabia is a fucked up country, and sometimes we've had to make accommodations with fucked up country. Hell, we were allied with Stalin in World War II.
So, when you said national security, what does Saudi Arabia have to do with our national security?
For example, we have base troops there in the Gulf War. I assume that means intelligence sharing. It means that roughly our interests and theirs are aligned in the Middle East. I realize that's a vague answer that won't satisfy you at all.
No, it won't, but I'm not going to cast blame or judgment on you for that. Yeah, that's a big criticism I have of our foreign policy, is the picking and choosing of fucked up people we align ourselves with or go to war with. Because weren't we buddies with Gaddafi for a long time?
We were buddies with Gaddafi in the 80s when he was at war with Iran, who we hated even more.
And why do we hate Iran?
Because of the revolution in 1979, they took a bunch of our people hostage in the embassy, and they proclaimed a theocracy, a religious state.
Okay.
And since then, of course, they've sponsored a lot of terrorism.
Weren't most of the terrorists from 9/11 from Saudi Arabia?
Yes. Now, it wasn't the official government policy, but certainly they also have funneled a lot of money to terrorists. So yeah, why we have the relationship with Saudi Arabia, I mean, it's in the papers now about whether we're going to support them in their war in Yemen or not.
Okay, and why are they going to war with Yemen? I know we're deviating a little bit, but this will tie into the point I'm going to make. Yemen
was for a long time a dictatorship who was roughly allied to the United States, and they've been in a state of civil war, and so it's a client war. So Saudi Arabia is backing one side, Iran is backing the other side. Since Iran is our enemy, we were supporting the other side in Yemen.
And now children are starving to death.
Yes. So, this Congress, I think, by bipartisan majorities, just voted against Trump's wishes that we should stop supporting Saudi Arabia in this war.
And then Trump vetoed that, right?
I haven't. I'll take your word for it. I didn't. Yeah.
If what I read was correct and he vetoed that, he's a fucking piece of shit and deserves to be hung for that. He
is a piece of shit, and we've long agreed on that. But we don't hang people in America.
If it was my way, I would. Certain people.
Getting back to the broader question, and we've argued a lot in this pod, but yeah, sometimes, there's been crazy wars motivated by capitalism or just idealism, like the 2003 war in Iraq that I think you, I, and Victor, all are against.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
All right, let's continue.
Okay.
That justifies the use of violence in all kinds of settings. and which grows directly out of the way the country was formed. This is on the one hand, the enslavement and importation of people from Africa, and on the other hand, the suppression and to a large extent annihilation of the Native American population. All these things have a permanent place in the culture of the country, and the forces that will rein that in again have to go up against a very determined establishment which is tolerant of that, because in order to attack all that, you'd also have to attack the whole basis on which the U.S. Prepares and justifies its policies of domination of other parts of the world. So it's all of a piece. So now you talk about revolution. I think a good, interesting example unfolding before our eyes, and with consequences which I'm not too optimistic about, is in Venezuela. I mean, in Venezuela, they were carrying out a revolution, and they were doing so through a legal process. And the ruling class didn't like it, nor did the U.S. ruling class. And so they determined to overthrow it, even though it satisfied all the requirements of democratic process and so on. And no, that was unacceptable. So the point is that, I mean, one has to look at each country. If you have a class that maintains, a privileged class that maintains itself in power using all kinds of force, it's not going to willingly give up its power. Now, obviously, we all have the desire that whatever changes are made will be made with the least possible amount of bloodshed. And to me, what that implies is that you have to build an enormous popular movement, which is so massive and so inspiring that it encourages a desertion, a changing of sides by people who are within the dominant machinery. And so revolution, and this I talk about in the first chapter of my Red-Green book, revolution refers to the scope of the changes, not to the way in which they're carried out. And you can have military coups and all kinds of things that are not at all in the direction of revolution, and it'll be very violent. And you can have a revolution, revolutionary process that's started on the basis of massive education and organization and mobilization. But then, if it's attacked, what's it going to do? You know, so it's a problem. But what I want to stress is that the violence is not should not be attributed exclusively to those who favor the revolutionary change. The element of violence arises from the unwillingness of the existing power holders to surrender what they feel they have a right to, and which is the basis for their domination over other people.
So just to summarize,
All right, pause.
or rephrase, you would say...
Okay, so he just talked a bunch about horrible things our government has done, but yet in his mind he wants the government to have more power and more money.
He wants, as far as I can tell, and it's too bad we don't have him here, yes, he wants a government, but he wants the government to be more responsive to the people. But yes, he does seemingly, I don't know, he wants government more responsive to the people. But I see your point, right? If the government is more responsive to the people and is more powerful, then it's unaccountable.
Yeah. And he's like, oh, the people in power don't want to relinquish this and that and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, so let's say they relinquish the power. Then what? Who's in charge? Who makes the decisions?
Right.
Are we all on the same frequency, all in agreement of how it's supposed to be run once we get the bad people in power out? I mean, this is totally like Animal Farm.
Though this is a point he returns to, that the people need to be educated. He says this again and again. The people need to be educated, and if they're educated enough, they will democratically not want these crazy wars of adventure, right? They won't want to go to war all the time. They won't want military involvement all the time.
But hasn't war been decreasing a lot in the past 100 or so years?
You need a bigger time frame to make that claim because the 100 years also included, well, I guess both world wars. But if historically, yes, there are fewer wars and fewer war deaths worldwide over time. And I
Yeah.
point out, Dalton, libertarian, this is a time when governments have all uniformly grown more powerful.
Well, I think the days of like battle lines and tanks and machine guns are like going away.
Thank God.
I think
Yeah.
you know, as crazy as Alex Jones is, I've heard him make this comment before. He's like he said that like the days of tanks and machine guns are going away, and now it's just going to be like that's why his website is called Infowars.
Insurgencies and guerrillas. Oh yeah, non-crazy, more reputable people have made that point.
Cyber wars,
Yeah.
the technology wars, like that's where it's at, not bombing people from the sky for days and weeks on end.
Oh yeah, certainly. I mean, it's not like tank divisions massed at the border and shit. It's not wars between states like conventional wars. It's insurgencies. Yeah. Anyhow, I'm happy to pursue this more of you, but we should stay on topic here.
Okay.
All right. Sorry. Capitalists in America and elsewhere in the world are responsible for so much violence that what a revolution would do is justified or is trivial in scope compared to the violence perpetrated by those with capital?
It's a very tricky issue because what we're talking about with revolution is a whole process, and I mean, just to give you an idea, there's a classic book by Mark Twain called The Mysterious Stranger. I don't know if you've ever read it.
I have not.
But he drew a comparison between the terror, and he was referring to the French Revolution,
right.
the terror that's perpetrated within the space of a few months versus the hunger, starvation, deprivation, what we now would call structural violence that's perpetrated permanently over the vast majority of the people. And I think the concept, the idea that depriving people of the basic necessities of life is itself a form of violence, and violence is being committed in that sense against the impoverished people, the people who are impoverished by having all their resources taken away from them. That is itself violence. So in terms of the whole moral issue, that's absolutely part of the equation. But what I was talking about before was more the different ways in which the change can take place. And for that, as I said, you have to look at the particular circumstances in each country. But I think you can say, for example, that if revolutionary mobilization, let's say political education, is underway in many places at once, it might outstrip the capacities of the dominant class to fight them all off at once. And it's quite conceivable that people who are in the enforcement machinery will shift sides. I mean, this is something that's happened historically in certain situations.
Right, like in February of Petrograd in 1970.
Exactly. That's one example. Another striking example was when they overthrew the Shah of Iran in 1979. They ordered the troops to fire on the crowd, and they refused. So and actually, the whole Chavista phenomenon in Venezuela, these were originally middle grade military officers, and they recognized they were reacting to a massacre that had been carried out by the conservative Venezuelan government in 1989, and that was the basis on which they sort of switched sides. So you have this phenomenon, which I see in embryonic form in the United States, in the whole phenomenon of whistleblowing, and I have an extraordinary admiration and hope for a group called the VIPS. You know that group?
I do not.
Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. That's what the acronym is for. And so it's something you might check out.
I'll make note of it. Thank you.
Yeah, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, the VIPs. So, and one of the most prominent among them now is a guy named Ray McGovern. You may have seen him making public speeches. Yeah, he's a retired CIA analyst. But it's an example of someone who comes from the inside, who has completely switched sides. And what I'm saying is that this is, at this point it's a drop in the bucket. But with a big cultural change, there could be encouragement for many others who are to come out of the woodwork and expose. And that's why, again, the WikiLeaks thing is so important now. The assault on Julian Assange, they're so embarrassed. The great thing about all that stuff is that what he revealed is undeniable truth. Nobody disputes the accuracy of the material that he made known, and it's precisely because of that they have to persecute. The idea that someone from within the government, or that you have a service that encourages and facilitates people from within the government to disclose the government's dirty secrets, that's the thing they're most afraid of. And so when you talk about revolutionary transformation, part of it is exposing the criminality of the business as usual as it's now conducted, and they clamp down on that with a fury, with an unbelievable fury. So revolution is bringing to light, in the first steps, educating the population, bringing to light how they're being screwed, and as this becomes widely known, as the machinery to spread the information develops, and as organization takes place, it can have a kind of snowballing effect, and you see it not necessarily in terms of complete revolution, but in terms of the discrediting of certain particular policies. And so I'm thinking of how finally the U.S. Occupation of Vietnam was discredited by became
Daniel Ellsberg. Ellsberg will always be a hero of mine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so revolution is a vast process, and the violence comes from both sides, and it's just one dimension of the process, and it's negotiable depending on a lot of different conditions, how much there has to be and how much there will be, whether one wants it or not.
I'm pausing. I'm sorry. In my mind, it is not an acceptable justification for violence to say capitalism is doing it, so it's okay if we do it. I think, legally, that's known as tu quo quo. You were doing it too. It's never an acceptable defense in court, and I just think it is immoral in almost all cases. Certainly, it's moral as self-defense if your person is attacked, but I struggle to justify violence, such as revolutionary violence, more generally that way.
Yeah, and it usually never turns out very good.
No. I mean, that was when Victor mentioned the French Revolution. There were, I don't know my French Revolutionary history that well, but there was violence, then repression, and a lot of instability for a decade until Napoleon came around.
Yeah.
So, all right, just wanted to. Okay, I'm gonna hit play. This is complicated. Now we agree about the evils of our current government. Mm-hmm. I'm a little more optimistic. I'm certainly critical, but more optimistic. So let me. Yeah. I could talk to you for a long time about many things. Let me ask you.
Evil.
How do you see? What would be your ideal economic organization? Are there any historical antecedents or examples you might cite?
Yeah. Well, I talk about this a little bit in the book, and I mean, there's no whole society that I would cite as a model, but there are particular things that have been done in different places, and the cooperative principle is something that I certainly support. And I think that, in terms of what was done on a national scale in Cuba is interesting in a number of dimensions, like the health service, which is well known to be extraordinarily effective. They have public health indicators at the level of the richest countries, precisely by the way they've organized it on a basis of preventive and having doctors everywhere and so on and so forth. So that's a good example, which is not to say that everything about Cuba is great.
Is that why so many people wanted to escape that place?
Well. They also seem to have developed a certain kind of...
Pausing. Yes. That is good health care is not enough to keep people happy, so you're absolutely right.
How good could it be?
It is very well-trained doctors and a total lack of resources. So it is good. But the point I make a minute is it's easy for a country to do one thing good, right? Soviet Union always had a powerful military, had a space program that at first was ahead of ours, but that still means the people were unhappy and living in poverty.
Yeah, and I'm willing to bet when you were in Cuba, Nick, if you blew your knee out and you needed ACL reconstruction surgery and the doctor says, we can do it here or we can send you back to the U.S. and you can have it done there, you're going to pick the U.S.
I would pick the U.S. just to give you an example. This joke always about medicine in Cuba is that doctors are really well trained, but just try to find an aspirin. Because they're so poor, they lack medical supplies. The medicine is good, but that's not enough to make people happy. And of course, they love treating Americans because they want to try to show us up.
Well, that's good. I'd rather have them have that attitude than say, fuck you, Americans, we're going to let you die.
No. When I was on a tour and a woman broke her foot on the tour and she got really good medical care because, they like treating Americans. They only charged her for the crutches.
Wow.
Yeah, but they can do that. The Soviet Union could build nuclear missiles, but
everybody is miserable.
Yes, so too can the North Koreans. All right,
Yeah.
Play. But yeah, I don't know. So I don't really know. Well, what that's an example of, that Cuba can have a good healthcare system and good public health services.
Well, it must not be good if you can't find aspirin.
Well, it's good training, but yeah, exactly. If they're poor and they can't get materials they need.
Yeah. All right. Pressing play.
Okay.
Ethic, which is quite impressive in terms of the voluntary service that people do in many parts of the world. Health workers, teachers, disaster relief workers, and so on. All that's a product of the revolution. And the literacy campaign in Cuba was extraordinary. I don't know if you know about it.
Yes.
Yeah, right. I mean, just the idea of it's not a matter of spending a lot of money and building a lot of buildings, but actually having a program of high school students going out and living with families and teaching the adults who are illiterate how to read. And so there are things which in a revolutionary context, it stimulates a certain type of creativity, and that's very important. So, and then others, you can pick other various examples here and there of things that have been done well. There's local examples of, for example, which I mentioned in the book, in the Italian city of Bologna in the 70s, they had a communist government, and which through a very democratic process of massive public discussion, redesigned the city to make sure that the center wouldn't be gentrified, and they remove cars from the whole central part of the city, but they did so not by decreeing it, but through a process of discussion and getting people to, taking into account the needs of all the people who would be affected by it. So it's examples like that here and there that you find things. And even some of the things in the Chinese Revolution, it's interesting about the way there was one of the books that impressed me a lot was one by William Hinton called Fan Shen. I don't know if you came across it. William Hinton was an American agronomist who worked in China precisely during the years of the liberation, 1948-49, and he wrote a book called A Documentary of Revolution in a Chinese Village. And the title he gave it was Fan Shen, which is a Chinese word meaning turning over. But the description he gave of how the women of the village organized to rise up out of their gender-based enslavement was amazing. So these are processes which are possible in various settings, and so you can learn from each process, and you try to collect and bring together the knowledge and look to every possible source. And this is the positive aspect of all the diversity that's created by the massive movements of people, in which people have to come together across lines of ethnicity and culture and so on, and recognize their common interests. But in the course of doing so, there can also be a lot of mutual sort of cross-fertilization of ideas and stimulus and so on.
So I would respond that there are certainly things that communist countries have done well. In the former Soviet Union, they did a great job of reducing illiteracy. I'm fond of Trotsky's aphorism about it. He said that illiteracy is spiritual lousiness, which is a good one. Certainly, the Soviet Union did marvels in terms of military development and a space program, but yet but both in China and the Soviet Union, millions and millions of people were put to death through forced collectivization of agriculture or just the whims of the ruler. So it's hard for me to look to either of those as a positive example. I'm pausing.
Sorry, Nick.
The
accomplishments in terms of literacy.
Yeah, well, that's why I don't take the totality of any country as a positive example. But more importantly, that's why I also say that everything has to be looked at in terms of the history of the particular country, and the fact that the conditions under which those revolutions were undertaken, and the fact that the Russian Revolution, first of all, it took place in a situation in which the country was already decimated by 3 years of war, and then was immediately subjected to 3 years of foreign military intervention. Was a poor country to begin with, and then was ostracized.
It's not a poor country to begin with. It was
it was poor in the sense it had a lot of resources, but the poverty of the people was great and was.
True. I mean, that's true in some respects. Most of them were peasant farmers, but it also had the fifth largest GDP of any country in the beginning of World War I.
Yeah, but the GDP, as we well know, that's just an average, and the overwhelming majority of the population was poor and in dire conditions, especially after those 6 years of war. So the point is that these were very unfavorable conditions, and also the fact, if you add to that, the fact that the whole prior development of the revolutionary organizations had been under a very repressive regime in which they hadn't developed the practices of open public activity.
Right.
So all those things put together, and then the decimation of the most dedicated working class leadership during the Civil War, so it laid the basis for what turned out to be a repressive practice. So, but that doesn't mean that that's going to be everywhere. I mean, and there are countries where the conditions are less dire, and where it could be done differently. And we already know from the way the processes have been initiated in other countries that it can be initiated differently. And there's one of the big, again, the idea of 21st century socialism, which was also very much promoted by Hugo Chavez, was that one of the things we learn, and it's not just by him, but there have been thinkers who've talked about it, like Istvan Meszaros and Michael Lebowitz, who talk about how the socialism of the 21st century, and actually the other person who's talking about it now is Richard Wolff, who has a great program called Economic Update. Socialism of the 21st century takes off from the position that you won't have a successful transformation unless you reconfigure power at the level of the productive enterprise, and you do away with the hierarchy between the bosses and the workers. And I just listened to the latest Economic Update, which is special with, I don't know if you know the Economic Update program of Professor Richard Wolff. Do you know that?
I don't.
Yeah, I strongly recommend it. Wolff with 2 F's. It's a weekly podcast that you can get. His website is called Democracy at Work, and he has a book of that title. And he has a strong critique of the Soviet Union, which I essentially agree with. That the point was that it wasn't socialist enough. That was the thing, in the sense that it didn't transform relations within the enterprise, the relations of production, as you might say, directly in the most direct sense. Just to put a new set of people in charge and to put it in the government instead of private corporations is not enough to transform, to bring about the transformation we're talking about. And when I gave my initial definition of socialism, saying when the class division has been eliminated, well, if you keep the kind of institutional separation between those who give the orders and those who follow them, that hasn't fully done away with it. So it's not that Russia was too much socialist. It wasn't socialist enough, is a way of putting it. And I think that's an important kind of thing to keep in mind. And so there's a great determination, and Chavez was influenced by this, and he was very much committed to the idea of creating democratic organizations in the neighborhoods and in the enterprises and so on. That this is part of what, again, was the strength, and I hope has not been destroyed completely, although it's been subjected to terrible siege. This is part of the appeal and the attractiveness of the movement that he led, and it's also part of the threat and part of why the capitalist ruling class wants to get rid of it. Even though it was doing it without attacking it, it was very generous. I mean, they had a coup in Venezuela, an attempted coup in 2002 that lasted for 48 hours.
Remember.
And they didn't even prosecute the people who launched the coup. I mean, it was. Can you imagine something like that being what they would do in the United States if someone did that? So, I mean,
remember George Bush's ham-fisted response to away, speak positively of the perpetrators of the coup, which
exactly
a little early.
Yeah, but that says a lot about.
It's just hard for me to see Venezuela as a positive example, given the fact that the government lacks democratic legitimacy, and that people there are unhappy and hungry, and services have collapsed. I just don't see it as a good example of much.
Yeah. I feel like all the things he's saying, it's like with a lot of like socialists, like I feel it's like you're looking at it the wrong way. You need to like kind of hop on the libertarian train, because you're talking about ruling elites and the powerful people and the ruling class and all these people with power and government, but yet they want a more powerful government. They just want it slightly different, and they just think like this revolution will happen and then everybody will be nice.
Victor says the people need to be educated in order for them to be nice.
Some of the most educated people in the world, I think, make terrible decisions as far as governing and war and violence.
See, they do, and I certainly sort of reject the populist notion that uneducated people can do government better. No, of course, people who are in government should be trained and experienced. Government's hard. But in terms of educating the people, one of the most reliable findings in political science and like in virtually in every field is that people are ignorant of everything. You know, they can't tell you water is wet. They can't recognize their state on a map. They don't know, you know, they don't know, they can't name the branches of government. People are ignorant, and you could get 10% of the population to agree to anything, that, you know, lizard men control the Senate, that whatever the fuck, right?
Yeah.
And
He's just way too unrealistic in his expectations of the so-called revolution.
My skepticism is that people could be educated as he suggests they can. They can be more educated, but I don't think they can be educated to the point that he wants or expects.
Well, you can be extremely educated, but you still might not have the viewpoint that he has.
That is true, too.
So it's like you can read all the things that he's read and go to college for 50 years, but he still might go, no, I don't think that's the right way.
How do I know my ideas are right? Because I try to find some consensus for them in the world that matters. I try to find, this is why what I said to you when you talked about mushrooms. Why haven't our politicians entertained this?
Because none of them have ever, or most of them have probably never done them.
Why would you think that?
Because none of them talk about it.
Not everyone talks about their drug use. But they have.
Probably because they'd be ridiculed or shamed or not taken seriously if they did.
Well, you know, I think we talked about Denver is considering legalizing psilocybin mushrooms. So, yeah. Anyhow, let's continue.
Okay.
And this is going to be a long one. Our potential to get off track is inherently great.
I love it.
All right. 1, 2, 3, and play.
Violence. You know, the violence comes from the ones who want to prevent the change from taking place.
So, last question. Although I certainly could talk to you a lot more and debate the Soviet Union and Marxism, is something you said on the interview I heard with you on the radio, where you and the host were joining together to disparage NASCAR as a prodigious waste of resources.
NASCAR? What was that?
Car racing, right?
Oh, yeah, car racing.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
yeah. So what about it?
I certainly have no interest in NASCAR, and Dalton didn't either, and in fact, it's lost a lot of fans in the last 20 years. And so I think I have no use for it, but millions and millions of Americans do. At its height, 60 million Americans had seen a NASCAR race in the past year. And huge swaths of the country are really invested in it. So perhaps they would say that the leisure activities that you and I prefer are a waste of resources. Say my foreign tourism. I mean, how do you respond to that? That while that might be objectively true, it's also seeking to impose cultural preferences on a huge portion of the population.
Yeah, well, you see, that's why I say that there has to be an enormous process of education. And the people are not sufficiently aware of the harm that's done by burning all that oil. I mean, they're not sufficiently aware of it. It's not something, we're in a real emergency. And, you know, not the kind of fake emergency that Trump talks about. We're in a real emergency of life and death because of the greenhouse gases. And the profligate burning of fossil fuel at the level of what they do there and the culture around it is something that has to be called into question. So I don't think we can accept that. But it doesn't mean, and my whole thing is, you can't eliminate it by decree, but there has to be an educational process. But at a certain point, there do have to be prohibitions, just as the way DDT had to be banned.
Okay, pause.
Certain things have to be banned. So
he said it wouldn't be stopped by decree, but then he goes, but at a certain point, so it will be forcefully stopped.
You raise a good point, Dalton. There is a real tension there.
And this education he keeps talking about sounds like it could be very forceful.
No, I don't think.
Especially coming from the government. There needs to be an education, and you're going to sit down, and you're going to listen to what the fuck I have to say, and you're not going to race cars anymore, and if you do, you're going to go to jail.
I don't think Victor means it in sort of a Maoist re-education camp, but I'll be more optimistic there. Okay, let me try to find some common ground with Victor and maybe with you. I think we could have better civics education. What does it mean to be an American citizen? What does our government do? How do you participate?
Means to defy the government. Shoot as many guns as possible. Drive fast cars with big V8s burning lots of gasoline.
That does not defy the government.
It will in Victor's government. I'm preemptively defying the government. I don't know. Oh, according to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, we're all gonna die in 12 years anyway. So fuck it. Why even worry about it?
Well, I do agree with Victor that we need to be really concerned with climate. But will we die in 12 years? That's a tougher sell. But we need to do more. We really need to do more.
Tell China and India, because it doesn't matter what we do, as long as if they don't change.
Right, but we can certainly lead the way.
And then they're gonna go, "You guys are dumb. We're burning all this oil and kicking ass."
No, it won't work that way. They'll also get polluted more, and China has so much smog; it's a health hazard. No, you heard what I said earlier in the pod. As countries develop more, they come to realize that pollution has side effects, even if you can't see climate change. It's really sort of crazy that the American conservatives are the only people in the world who deny it.
All right, let's continue.
All right.
This kind of totally wasteful activity has to be called into question and is part of it would only be as part of a really enlightened process that the common. I mean, it's also urgent. It's hard to imagine. Granted, it's taking place soon, but this is the challenge that we face. It absolutely can't be accepted. And I mean, I'm thinking now of Greta Thunberg. You've probably seen her speech, have you?
I'm not sure if I have, but go on.
Greta Thunberg, Thunberg. She's the 16-year-old Swedish high school student.
Oh yes, yeah.
Yes, yeah. I watched her speech to the European Union.
Yeah, she's a remarkable woman.
She's wonderful.
I hope she gets the Nobel Prize.
Yeah, wonderful. But the point is that she expresses the urgency of the situation, and it's precisely because of the urgency of the situation when I say people flying around too much and so on. Well, the car racing is just the epitome, the culmination of that kind of wasteful thing, just driving round and round and round to see how fast you can go. It's not even healthy, there's nothing positive about it. So the fact that it's part of the culture is just like saying, well, gun rights, so-called, are part of the culture too. So there'll be just as much of a protest against the removal of so-called gun rights as there would be but these, just because it's accepted doesn't mean that it has to be. And one of the things that in the educational process to really bring about a change in people's understanding is greater understanding of other countries and how people live better in other countries, and where they in certain other countries where they don't have these kinds of things, where there's been a stronger, a more of a civilizing force. I mean, I can mention also, and we can come back to the social democracies. There are a lot of progressive things about the social democracies, and I think, again, especially in this matter of culture, we get back to the issue of incarceration. I mean, there's such an attitude of lock them up in this country, and such a punitive culture of punishment and revenge and harshness and abuse, which is encouraged on the part of prison guards, and the diametric opposite like in Norway in particular.
Oh yeah, I think of Anders Breivik.
Yeah, right.
In a cell who has a TV and an Xbox and all that. Yeah,
so it's This is what my other book, The Democracy Denied, sort of focuses on. Is trying to get the reader to call into question some of the aspects of the United States and see the connection between the unhealthy things that we all recognize and some of these cultural things that people that so many people think they can't do without. But I mean, another thing there that's very striking, and a lot of these examples, the U.S. influence is spreading to other countries, but I think also in this connection of this epidemic of obesity from the processed foods and the sedentary lifestyle and so on. This is all part of driving around and round in circles and burning a gallon every half mile. I mean, it's an outrage. And
well, that may be a tough sell in a country where so many people were willing to vote for Trump.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. It is a tough sell. The U.S. is the hardest nut to crack. That's why I try to take it on a little bit in this book. I think that one of the things that it'll involve is people coming to understand the connections between aspects that are widely recognized to be problematic and those that they have been taken for granted as absolutely unquestionable. But I mean, the whole commercial culture and the ubiquity of advertising in every possible setting and all these things, it all fits together. There's a coherence to it, and if one can see the connection between that and the violence and distrust that exists just on a day-to-day level among people, the level of distrust of strangers and the suspicion and all the this. I mean, to me, I find it amazing that there's so many good people in this country despite that, but it's not enough to neutralize yet that whole what you call the Trump constituency or whatever. But what goes into that? This is a challenge. It absolutely has to be rejected. But I mean, again, we have partial examples of where this has been done. I mean, so they eliminated legal segregation in the South. Well, it doesn't mean that all the attitudes have disappeared, right. But to a certain extent, there was a transformation. But the transformation comes about partly by education and interaction, but partly by legal, partly by legal, enforced by the force of law, so that just protecting the civil rights workers and so on, with armed force. So you might say that there was tremendous routine violence as the way in which the segregated system was maintained, the Ku Klux Klan and vigilante violence and all that. So you had a nonviolent movement against it, but it had to be backed up by the threat of force against those who would attack them. So on a limited scale, that's again a kind of illustration of the dynamics that are involved in any kind of transformation, even though it was an incomplete transformation. But it involved confronting the violence and also challenging the assumptions. I mean, because for all those people, white people growing up in the South, where they had even rituals of lynching, they seem to the ritual aspect would make it seem as though it was a perfectly natural thing. Anyone who would challenge the separation of the races was challenging the natural order of things. Well, so I think there are not too many people who would say it's a natural order anymore. There's probably some, yes, like the Dylan Roof types, but and it still hasn't disappeared. But there's been something of a change. Well, that has to come about in relation to the environmental issue and calling into question habits that we've become used to and taken for granted that can no longer be accepted anymore. We can no longer do things if we want to survive as a species.
We should probably stop there because we could go on for some time if we didn't.
Okay.
And I have a meeting I need to get to at 7 my time.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time, Victor. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, well, I enjoyed talking with you, and will this be posted somehow on
Yes.
online where I can
Yeah,
when you
I will send you
when you have it?
I will
please
send you a
it.
link.
Okay, that would be great.
All right, I stopped. Dalton?
Yes. Yep.
All right, so we are coming to a close. Is there anything you want to add to say to Victor when he hears it, or to say to any of our enormous fan base?
I think we have similar goals, but just opposite ways of achieving that goal.
I think that's reasonable.
I think his heart's in the right place, but I think he's, from my very uneducated viewpoint, from how I see the world, I think more freedom and less government will bring about the things that he wants.
And
Especially when it comes to the wars and the violence and the mass incarceration.
all right, I could.
You don't have to refute that.
No,
you can just
no.
leave it be.
I want to, of course, but we can just leave it there. We've gone long enough.
All right.
All right. Thank you, Dalton.
Drive muscle cars, drink cold beer, shoot guns, go fast, have fun. America.
These are fun things, but part of America is also civic responsibility. Oh, fuck. Okay, I'm losing control of all the different windows I have going.
You're good.
You want to call it good?
Yep.
All right. Thanks for listening to another episode of Professor and the Idiot. If you like what you heard, go to Apple Podcasts and give us a good rating so that others may find us and we can expand our social media juggernaut. And if you didn't like it, fuck off to the place you came from.